This podcast is brought to you by the Prospect Research Institute, where researchers come to learn, innovate, and connect.
Thing I love about philanthropy is that it's ultimately a very democratic thing. We, a group of 10 people, of 10,000 people, decide we want something to happen or something to be different. And we make it happen through money and through volunteerism. And so that's universal. That's true everywhere.
Welcome to Prospect Research Chat Bites, a podcast by and for prospect research professionals. I'm Jennifer Filla. Today, I'm talking with Robert Osborne, principal of the Osborne Group.
Hello, Bob. Thank you for joining me today on Chat Bite.
Thanks, Jen. I'm super happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So before we jump into international fundraising, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share a little bit about your career, like how you came into fundraising, and then the kind of work that you're doing now.
Sure. Well, one, I sort of grew up with it. Both my parents were very involved with not-for-profits, and my mother, Karen Osborne, is a very well-known fundraising trainer and consultant. So in some ways, I guess this was inevitable, although it didn't feel that way at the time. To me, it still felt like I kind of fell into it in the sense of just being a good writer. And I think like a lot of folks, I got into it through grant writing and for the organization I was working with, and then kind of realized that I had a good resource with my mother to kind of maybe advance and go further and have an internal consultant. And then I was also working for, looking back on it, a really great group of fundraisers and for a small little school in Harlem. And I just kind of got lucky, I think, in working with some folks who were both really good volunteers and really good not-for-profit leaders. And so learned a lot from them as well. And yeah, like most people just kind of that are in our field, just sort of fell into it and just kind of kept going. So fast forward to today, I do consulting for not-for-profits, part of the Osborne Group. We do management consulting, fundraising consulting, and opinion research. We do big strategic planning projects around development. We're doing a lot of work around diversity, equity, inclusion right now, and how that impacts fundraising and how that impacts strategic planning. It's been a good career, 30 years or so. And I think it's more exciting than ever for me. I mean, I think some of the things we're working on today are really interesting and relevant. I'm still always happy to be doing my job.
So I know in previous talks we've had just how interesting your work is. And you've mentioned a number of times that you have a lot of international experience. You've mentioned different projects you've been working on. And I'm curious, how did that come about? And what do those projects look like? Is it similar to the US? How is it different?
So it's another thing that I would say sort of fell into my lap, but I was happy to embrace. I attended the IFC, the International Fundraising Congress, maybe in like 2008, 2009, and presented there on major gift fundraising. And I think from there, I was just contacted from a lot of groups to do consulting work. So happy to go there and happy to do it. I wasn't necessarily expecting any business to come out of it. I was expecting a nice fun trip to the Netherlands to come out of it, and hadn't been there prior to that. But it really opened the door for a lot of international work. And then the Osborne Group had also been doing some work already with some large groups that have an international footprint. So they might be based in the US, they might be based in Europe, but they do work around the globe. So the Greenpeaces and the Amnesties of the world. And so I just found myself doing that work and, doing some work for a variety of different organizations that were based out of Brussels. And then I was invited to go to Serbia by a woman who worked for Junior Achievement in the US. And she told me that the folks in Serbia, Junior Achievement Serbia, were looking for somebody and did I want to go? And it was a 3-week gig. And so, sure, why not? And so I ended up spending 3 weeks in Serbia and then was able to build off some work from there, doing some work for the US Embassy and doing some work for USAID. And the projects I've been doing there for the most part, at least back then, were really pretty standard fundraising projects. United States and to a certain extent UK are seen as sort of the leaders in this space in terms of theory, at least. As government funding started shrinking, even in Europe, there was more need to do fundraising and I think more of an interest, fundraising and learning from international experts. And so did a lot of sort of what we would consider, you and I would probably consider fairly basic fundraising consulting. But over the years, I think that work has gotten more sophisticated and more interesting. And then our own work as the Osborne Group, we started to do more work around international major gift campaigns, which was really cool. So campaigns that span the globe. And I think today folks really recognize that there's a lot of wealth and talent that exists outside of the US. And so I think more and more groups now are looking, to Asia, to Europe, Dubai, Africa for this kind of work. So been lots of different projects, but I would say, most of them have been pretty straight ahead fundraising projects, although I think there's some real differences too in how you have to approach the work internationally.
Right. So you go to Serbia for 3 weeks. I still don't have a clear picture of what you did. Like, what do you do? Did you say, okay, you need to send messages and ask for money in these periods of time? Here's the kind of messaging. Cool. What did you do?
What did I do? So it was mostly around creating a fundraising plan, sustainability plan for that group. And I do think most fundraising theory does translate pretty well around the world, particularly major gift theory, because it's based on human nature. So a lot of the work is really translating it into the circumstances on the ground, but not necessarily changing the theory. A lot of my work was in Eastern Europe and really helping them around major gift fundraising, because unlike Western Europe, Western Europe is very, has a pretty strong social safety net in a way that the US doesn't, and lots of other places around the world don't. Eastern Europe kind of went straight from communism to pretty hardcore capitalism right off the bat. So there really was a need for a civil sector and therefore for fundraising and supporting NGOs. So it was projects around sustainability, major gift campaigns, even although on a much smaller scale than we do here in the US. How do you build your volunteer base? How do you just do fundraising, right? Like beyond just direct marketing, how do you really do relationship-based fundraising? So I think most of the projects were in line with relationship-based fundraising. I think most countries do understand direct marketing pretty well. Like that's pretty universal at this stage, but I think less so around fundraising that's more about, the one-on-one conversations you have with people. How do you identify, as you know, identification is a big part of this work. How do you do that? And how do you find those people, and how do you talk to them, and how do you convince them to give you money?
Right. I stayed in Prague for a number of years. My husband and I would visit and stay for a month or longer. And I know you've been involved with the Prague nonprofit center there. I forget the name of it.
Czech Fundraising Center.
Czech Fundraising Center. And when I was there, I would network with different people working in the nonprofits. And some of the things I learned were, volunteer. Well, that's a double-edged sword. We need to call it something else, because in communism, you were always volunteering, but it was
right.
not, it was not a choice. And the level of corruption was high. So when you talk about like relationship-based fundraising, it felt like it was in hyperdrive. So if I don't know the people on the board, then there's no way I'm ever giving them money, because I don't trust that they will actually put it to the mission. Is that kind of like what you mean when you say working with people is the same, but adapting it to the world around them is different?
Yeah, I would say that that's pretty accurate in understanding, right, what are the facts on the ground in this particular place? What is the level of trust? What, if anything, is the culture of philanthropy? Is this something completely new for this culture? Is this something that existed maybe with their grandparents but went away during communism? And that's often the case. A lot of these Eastern European countries did have a strong legacy of philanthropy prior to communism. So it's not completely forgotten, but it definitely has a different context, and it's slower. I was just in Prague and Bratislava last fall, and for the first time at this particular conference, a friend of mine was presenting on a successful capital campaign as a case study. And so that was something that was talked about maybe 10 years ago, 5 years ago, but not something that was really being practically implemented, except in like rare exceptions where some oligarch or some big leader wanted to just get something done and just pointed at a few people and it got done. But I mean, like a real fundraising project, the way we think about a fundraising project, they're just happening, I think, in some places in Eastern Europe, and, in each country's in a different place. I think, Czech Republic is probably a little further along than some other Eastern European countries. And then when you go into Western Europe, outside of the UK and the Netherlands and a few other places, there isn't the need really for that scale fundraising often. And it's not to say it doesn't happen. I think it does, but you don't see it on the scales that we see it. So each country is a little different, and you have to understand the culture, whatever the prior culture of philanthropy is, or the existing culture of philanthropy. And there's other little vagaries as well. Like in the Netherlands, you're not supposed to kind of put yourself, you're not special, right? So the idea of standing out, giving a lot of money, your name being listed somewhere, asking people for money, like all of that, like you don't talk about that, you don't do that. So there's little things like that as well that have to be overcome, and you really only learn of that if you're there and you're talking to people. People do want to do good, they want this thing to happen. How do we figure it out together and make sure it happens, even though there's these different cultural norms?
What do you attribute to your success as a consultant jumping into other countries? Like, were you afraid of the language barriers? Like, how did you make that bridge?
Well, one thing I found out I just really loved doing it. It turns out I like going to other countries, and I like problem solving. And, I joke with my wife that in a different world, I think I could see myself being like a war correspondent or something. Like I just sort of like going into challenging situations and kind of figuring it out. I think good relationship-based fundraising is based on human behavior. And I think human beings act the same wherever they are. There may be different circumstances, but we largely want the same things. And I think if you kind of fundamentally understand that and believe that, then it's really learning enough about the country from the people themselves. Like you're not really going to be able to figure it out yourself. But if you talk to enough people and you listen and you really hear what they're trying to tell you, then you can figure out together, how do we achieve the same result? Like, how do we use those same human forces to get what we want? And a lot of it, just like here in the United States, is just talking to people, right? It's just asking questions, figuring it out. The thing I love about philanthropy is that it's ultimately a very democratic thing. We, a group of 10 people, of 10,000 people, decide we want something to happen or something to be different. And we make it happen through money and through volunteerism. And so that's universal. That's true everywhere. I think it's a rare person that looks around and things are exactly the way they would like them to be. And I think most people are altruistic and want their communities to be better and want more opportunity for their families and their communities and their children. And so it's just figuring out, how do we use that under these circumstances? How do we get everyone moving in the same direction? And so I like to think that that's something that I and the Osborne group is good at and understands. And, the assignment when you're going international is really just to figure out talk to enough people on the ground there that you can adapt those fundamental principles to the circumstances on the ground.
How do you see prospect research playing a role now in all those different places that are doing these fundraising campaigns and major gifts?
Well, I think it's challenging. I mean, so we're talking about international fundraising, and international is everywhere that's not here. So it varies very greatly, I think, depending on where you are. A lot of our experiences in the Pacific Rim and Europe. And, I think the biggest challenge in those places is that privacy laws are very different. A lot of the things that we take for granted, like well screening, you cannot do in most of Europe. It doesn't exist. You're not allowed to do it. The information doesn't really exist. And so I think it's interesting because I think, I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about this, because I think some of those laws are coming here, and it might start to make some of what we do here in the United States even harder as we think about data privacy and we think about the kind of information we collect on people and how we collect it and even how long we're supposed to store it. And so in Europe, it becomes, in particular, but I think this is true depending on anywhere that has more restrictive data laws, it just becomes more peer-to-peer, right? It becomes more relying on talking to people and finding out directly from folks, as opposed to us being able to rely on publicly available information, which exists much less. And even if you can find it, there's limitations on how you're allowed to use it and to store it and to track it. So I think it's an interesting challenge that we may end up facing here. I'm curious about what you think about that. But I think it puts the impetus on really building out those networks and talking to people to figure out who your good prospective donors are going to be and find out information about them. It's really hard to do, if not impossible, electronically.
Yes, that's true. Although if you're doing a great job as a fundraiser in terms of like the marketing funnel, let's build awareness, let's engage the entire community and bring them through to learn more about us so that they start giving more, they give for a longer period of time. I mean, that kind of natural progression through good practice yields great result. And it prevents people from saying, can you get me that wealthy list? I'm going to chase them down. And if one of them gives to us, then it's worth it.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of practice is pretty lazy. So I think it's a mixed bag, but I think we sometimes have practices that are not as effective, but we can do it because we have so much data.
Right. No, I think you're right. I mean, 90% of good research, right, is just asking questions and talking to people. And it's going to be a lot more reliable than anything you find through other means. So I think you're right. It just puts the impetus more on doing that work well. That said, it does become harder in the sense also sometimes internationally because you have to work a little harder to build that volunteer base and to have those conversations with people and to even make them willing to talk about their neighbor or to talk about. I mean, I think Americans, we're fairly straightforward in that respect and don't really. We're pretty okay with that, and that's not always true in other countries. You know, there's different norms around that. But again, I think it's like you said, it's trust, and if you can have trusted sources and people trust you, I think that's a very universal thing. So it's not that it can't be done, and it's not that the same principles don't work, but it's just what we were talking about before. You just have to adapt them a little bit and be more flexible about them. And then in the case of a number of countries now too, is like you think about how you store the information, you know, how you track it and store it. I think that's real, but I think there's other ways of working around that as well.
Wow. So you just hit it. There's that need for process, for segmentation of your existing donors, all that prospect management work, moves management, research is really good at that. We are process people, and feeding people the names of those that they should call and build a deeper relationship. That's really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. As we were saying before, I mean, it's very much the same. And there's a reason I think that the US and UK based fundraisers are often imported into other parts of the world to do fundraising because the fundamentals do work. There's no place I've been where I've had to say, well, this is completely different. I have to do things totally differently. Sometimes my clients think that coming in and there's a belief that you might have to kind of shatter. I mean, my first 2 weeks in Serbia, I could tell that the executive director I was working with just wasn't buying anything that I was selling her. And we had to have a very, very frank conversation, where I asked her to take a few chances with me. She did, and it was very successful, and she was able to raise a decent amount of money. The fundamentals work because the fundamentals are about human beings talking to each other and trusting each other and trying to work towards a common good. That's a very universal idea. Nothing about international fundraising is radically different. It's having that inquisitive openness where you don't feel like you have the answers. You feel like you have some concepts that you think are going to work, but listening to the folks on the ground and really working together to figure out what the solution might be.
Before I let you go, what continuing education do you recommend for prospect researchers when it comes to fundraising across countries?
Yeah, it's a good question. As far as I know, and this could be wrong, but I'm not aware of like an APRA for Europe. I'm not even sure what they would do there because the rules are so different and it's different from country to country and maybe it exists in Africa or Asia. I'm not sure. So there's not necessarily a place to go to find this information. Like I said before, you have to ask the questions and talk to people. So, what I would say is talk to fundraisers in other parts of the world or go and check it out. Go to some of these international conferences, big ones. There's small ones too, though, that you can go to that are affordable. There's often a hunger for information in a lot of these countries. So you can always apply as a researcher or as a consultant or as a practitioner to go speak on these topics somewhere and meet people and talk to them. So I can't say that everything I've learned that's been meaningful about international fundraising has been on the ground, really doing it there's very little, if any, that I've learned by just researching it. And of course, you can research it. There is information out there about it, and increasingly so. And so you can always check that out too. But I wouldn't say that there's any like one repository for it. So I'd say, hey, it's a great excuse to travel the world and check some things out. If you have opportunities here in the United States for fundraisers and researchers that are visiting, I think that's another way to go. Check out blogs. I mean, they're all out there, but it's one of those things. As researchers, you might have to do a little research to find the scattered bits of information that are out there in the world.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing.
Thanks, Jenna. I really appreciate you having me.
That was Robert Osborne, principal of the Osborne Group. You might be looking for that strategic planning fundraising consultant who can untangle the knots, helping you find solutions anywhere around the globe. Or you might just want to be a part of the conversations at the Osborne Group around fundraising and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Visit the Osborne Group online at www.theosbornegroup.com. Osborne is spelled Osborne, theosbornegroup.com. And check out their video blog and tools and resources. You won't be disappointed. Hey, if you enjoyed listening to this podcast, you have to come check out the Prospect Research Institute's learning community. It's a membership community with powerful resources, great discussions, and comprehensive courses. Check it out at member.prospectresearchinstitute.org. I'd love to have you join me as a member of the learning community. See you there.